Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CJCA Positive Youth Outcomes Committee webinar. I'm Wendy Faulkner, Assistant Executive Director of CJCA. This is our first in a two-part series of webinars focused on improving services for LGBTQI youth in the juvenile justice system. Today's webinar will provide an overview to LGBTQI and a call to action. I would like to thank all of you for taking time to participate in this webinar today, and special thanks to Peter Forbes, Commissioner, and Michelle Phillips, both from Massachusetts UIS, who have put a great deal of work into the preparation of this webinar, as well as our facilitator and presenters for today, who Peter will introduce shortly. For those of you who might be new to CJCA, we are a national nonprofit organization formed in 1994 to improve juvenile justice systems, local secure correctional and residential facilities, services, programs, and most importantly, long-term outcomes for youth and their families. CJCA represents the juvenile justice system CEOs in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and various major metropolitan counties across the country. At this point, I'm going to ask Darlene Conroy to provide us with a few technical instructions before we start. Darlene?
Thank you, Wendy. We just wanted to review a few webinar items before we start. Please choose the Use Telephone feature from the audio button and call in using the phone number and PIN provided. Everyone on the webinar is muted. At the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. Please type questions in at any time during the webinar. These will be answered during the 10 to 15 minutes session at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded. A copy of the PowerPoint and link to the recording will be sent to attendees following the webinar. Peter?
Good afternoon. Darlene, thank you very much. This is Peter Forbes with the Mass Department of Youth Services and the Positive Youth Committee for CJCA. I want to thank Wendy and the team at CJCA, Darlene and Chastity, who are supporting the call today and have done some background work. I want to recognize Simone Gonsolin from the American Institute of Research, who's going to facilitate our Q&A. Michelle Phillips from our team, who Wendy mentioned. And then I'm going to introduce, in 1 second, I'm going to introduce our presenters. This webinar was actually prompted by a discussion that took place at the CJCA winter meetings. A number of agency directors, primarily from the Northeast region, expressed interest in what a model policy in practice would look like for working effectively with LGBTQ youth. We reached out to Curry Cook and Shannon Wilbur, who have agreed to facilitate today, present today's discussion. So I'm going to introduce Curry, and then I'm going to introduce Shannon, and we're going to go right into the presentation. Curry Cook is Counsel and Director of the Youth and Out-of-Home Care Project at Lambda Legal, the nation's oldest and largest national legal organization committed to achieving full recognition of the civil rights of LGBT people and people with HIV. Cook advocates on behalf of LGBTQ youth in child welfare and juvenile justice settings, and on behalf of youth experiencing homelessness. He works at the state and federal level to achieve systemic reform through a mix of litigation, proactive law and policy development, and training for system professionals. Prior to joining Lambda 6 years ago, Curry represented children in child welfare and juvenile court cases in Alaska, New Jersey, and New York. Shannon Wilbur is a career child advocate, having worked over 30 years on behalf of children and youth in the child welfare and juvenile justice setting. She currently serves as the Youth Policy Director at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, where she focuses on promoting systems and policy change to promote the health and well-being of LGBTQ youth nationally. She's been instrumental in developing state and federal policies, regulations, and legislation to prohibit public agencies from discriminating against LGBTQ youth. She's worked in the Casey Foundation, the PREA Resource Center, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention to develop best practices to protect the safety and well-being of LGBTQ youth who are held in secure confinement settings. Her work is widely cited in a growing number of advocacy professionals working to promote the health and well-being of LGBTQ youth in their homes, schools, communities, and public systems of care. I took a little extra time to read more of the background on Shannon and Curry, just so the audience gets an understanding that we've got two of the top internationally that have sharing their time and their expertise with us today. So I'm going to go right to Shannon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. This is Shannon Wilbur, and welcome to everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about what we're going to try to cover in this hour, and I'm sure you can imagine that we could have a much longer conversation about these concepts. We're going to try to get in as much as we can in this webinar. So we're going to start by talking about kind of the foundational concepts and terminology, which we'll do fairly quickly, but just to get everybody on the same page. We will talk then about the research and data that we have that talks about the numbers of LGBTQ youth in the justice system, as well as some of the disparities. We will spend some time talking about the law and policy and professional standards that govern the treatment of LGBTQ youth in the justice system. And then we'll end up by talking about what some of the state and local policies that have been adopted cover with respect to LGBTQ youth in the justice system. Next slide, please. So as I said, we're going to talk a bit first about concepts and terminology. Next slide. So this first slide that you see actually depicts several layers of or aspects of identity. And the important thing to think about is that these aspects don't operate in isolation, but they actually overlap and interact with one another. And together, they have a very profound influence on a person's experiences. And that includes young people prior to their involvement in the justice system and during their involvement in the justice system. The other thing to think about is that some of these aspects of identity may place youth at risk of bias or mistreatment, while others may create layers of privilege or protection. Next. So you'll see from the little, oh, no, you were right in the first place. Go back. If you can. There you go. So today we're focused on what I will call SOGI. And when we say SOGI, it's an acronym that's been developed to pertain to sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So that's our focus today, but it's always important to consider the whole person, the whole youth, and all of these layers of identity to understand their experiences and their needs and their strengths. Next slide, please. So the first aspect of SOGI, the SO, stands for sexual orientation. Next. So as you see here, sexual orientation refers to a person's romantic, physical, and/or sexual attraction to people of the same or a different sex. Words that we use to describe sexual orientation, a person's sexual orientation, include gay, lesbian, straight or heterosexual, pansexual, bisexual, asexual, queer, questioning, and there's a growing list of terms. We'll talk a little bit about that. One thing to remember is that everybody has a sexual orientation, not just LGBTQ people. Children begin to having an awareness of their sexual orientation as young as 10, prior to their being sexually active, but usually in the form of crushes or feelings about other people. So that sexual orientation begins to develop at a fairly early age. It's also important to keep in mind that you can't tell a person's sexual orientation by looking at them. And I think one of the important practice tips is that there's only one reliable means of identifying a person's sexual orientation, and that's by asking them to identify it. Next. So the GI of INSOGI stands for gender identity. And gender identity, as it says here, is a person's own very deeply felt internal sense of being a man, a woman, or neither of those things. And when we say it's the primary determinant of sex, what we mean by that is a person who has a female gender identity, for example, is female for all purposes. Gender identity is different from a person's body parts or the sex that they were assigned at birth. And when I say sex assigned at birth, I mean literally the sex that the doctor or the nurse or the medical professional assigned to the infant at birth, usually based on anatomy. So that's what we mean when we say assigned sex. A person's gender identity may or may not be the same as their assigned sex. Some of the words that we use to describe a person's gender identity are girl or woman, boy or man, gender non-binary, meaning neither male nor female, gender fluid, or transgender. A transgender person means that that person's gender identity is different from their assigned sex. The majority of people are what we call cisgender, and that means a person's gender identity is the same as their assigned sex. And once again, like sexual orientation, everyone has a gender identity, not just transgender or gender non-binary people. And again, you can't tell a person's gender identity by looking at them either. Not safe to make those assumptions. That's something you should ask the person directly. Okay, next, please. And the third aspect of SOGI, the E in SOGI, stands for gender expression. And this refers to really how a person communicates their gender to others through their dress or their hairstyle or their mannerisms or other characteristics. Again, every person has a gender, expresses their gender. And some of the words we use to describe gender expression are feminine, masculine, androgynous, or gender nonconforming. So that's a lot of information in a short time because we have a lot to talk about today, but the main takeaways here are that these aspects of a person's identity are distinct from one another. So one thing that happens often is people conflate sexual orientation and gender identity, for example, but they are actually separate parts of a person's identity. And as I said, every person has a SOGI, not just LGBTQI people. And finally, keep in mind that language is changing. The list of terms that describe these various aspects of identity gets longer and longer, and it varies in different cultures, and particularly among young people. So the important thing isn't so much to be an expert on all the terminology, but to be respectful and to defer to young people around the language they use to identify themselves. And I'm going to turn it over to Curry.
Hi, everyone. This is Curry Cook from Lambda Legal. I use he, him, and his pronouns. And thank you so much for attending this webinar, and thank you to CJCA for having us here to talk with you. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about just kind of a glimpse into some of the research and data that we have around LGBTQ youth in juvenile justice settings and other systems of out-of-home care, and also a little bit about some statistics we have about health and well-being for LGBTQ youth generally. So this first slide around pipelines into juvenile justice and criminal justice systems is really just a graphic kind of representation of some of the data that we know is out there. And many of you watching may be thinking, well, wait a minute, like these pipelines actually kind of affect all youth, or these different areas can be pathways into contact with the juvenile justice system for all youth. And that's absolutely right. And what we wanted to emphasize a little bit today is sometimes the question of sort of why, like why are we focusing on LGBTQ youth specifically, and why are we talking about a separate policy when LGBTQ youth really have many of the same needs as their non-LGBTQ peers. So going into the data a little bit helps explain why. And if we think about these various pipelines, if we look at school, for instance, we know from a lot of data, particularly around school resource or safety officers, that gender nonconforming youth, youth that are perceived to be LGBTQ or LGBTQ, have higher rates of contact with school resource officers, school safety officers, and higher incidence of arrests from school. Many of you may have seen, for example, the movie Moonlight, where one of the main characters there is getting bullied in school, lashes back out, and then ends up being the one who's arrested for assault and taken to the juvenile detention center. So instances of bullying, harassment, conflict at school, those sorts of things based on discrimination happening on account of a young person's actual or perceived identity can mean higher incidences of contact with law enforcement and justice systems out of school. Similarly, just by virtue of being in the foster care system, young people have a higher incidence of contact with the juvenile justice system. But for LGBTQ young people, particularly in congregate care settings or other placements where either the placement itself or maybe conflict with peers develops over the young person's identity or expression, results in increased contact with the juvenile justice system out of foster care. Obviously, homelessness in and of itself, we know, is a factor in justice contact. And for LGBTQ youth, that can be at higher rates because, again, of conflict in the shelter setting, or, for example, engaging in survival sex as a means to get by if you've been kicked out or pushed out of home because of who you are. And then finally, we have walking wild. So we know that people of color in general have higher incidence of contact with law enforcement and arrests. We have a lot of information from trans people of color in particular about having higher incidence of contact with law enforcement, and also just policing around Black and brown youth in general and LGBTQ youth of color in particular. So for example, here in New York City, in the course of research around the stop and frisk practices here, Christopher Street in the West Village, while the entire rest of the neighborhood had very few stops and frisks in that data, Christopher Street, where a number of LGBTQ youth of color had tons and tons of contact and stops from police officers. And I think a really important takeaway back to the slide Shannon showed you at the beginning around dimensions of identity is, for example, if you are an African-American transgender girl, you may have all of these pipelines sort of operating in you simultaneously. Basically having our general statistics for youth and pipelines into incarcerations kind of be on steroids. Next slide. So that leads us to just some statistics about numbers in general. And I think important to point out that there isn't a tremendous amount of research around LGBT youth and justice systems, although there is a growing body of work. And a piece of that has been some hesitancy historically to be asking young people in these settings about how they identify, partly for fear of putting them at increased risk, or comfort of people asking about identity and questions of experiences and care. But as we increase protections for youth in these systems, better practices, making sure young people are safe, if we're involving in studies, we have more information. So this particular study for this slide was done by Angela Irvine and Aisha Canfield, and shows some pretty interesting numbers. So the big takeaways are 20% of youth in juvenile justice facilities that they surveyed identified as LGBTQ. And for girls in the juvenile justice system, even higher stats of around 40% in facilities identified as LGBTQ. And another important piece of this recognition of the population that we're talking about and the intersection of identities is that of these young people that were LGBT or gender nonconforming, 85% of those youth surveyed were youth of color. So many young people in the systems have experienced discrimination, mistreatment, bias involved getting in the system and in the system around multiple aspects of who they are. Okay, next slide. Yeah, you can go ahead and click through these. There we go. So just wanted to also acknowledge that while we're talking about the juvenile justice system, that LGBTQ youth are overrepresented in other out-of-home care systems, represent about 20% of kids in the child welfare system, and a pretty staggering 40% of youth experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ youth. So again, you may be recognizing this from a lot of the young people that you work with who aren't LGBTQ and become multi-systemically involved. But a different aspect of sort of why these rates are really high for LGBTQ youth in part centers around rejection and neglect at home around who you are. So if you're not picked up, if you're experiencing rejection or being kicked out of your home because of who you are, you may not be picked up by the child welfare system and go directly into homelessness, increasing your possibility of contact with the justice system, or you may be picked up and end up in the child welfare system, and then a lack of affirming placements and home placements leads you to congregate care. A non-affirming congregate care placement leads you to conflicts. You take, matters in your own hands and exit and end up homeless. Or if you don't have an affirming caseworker or a parent and you're being bullied at school, you may not have an advocate to go to tell the school that the conflict is around bullying and the school should do more. Or in thinking about additional factors, if you're an undocumented LGBTQ person who has ended up in this country fleeing persecution in your country of origin, that may add a whole other layer of systemic involvement. So a piece of what we're going to talk about at the end of the webinar today is a little bit about sort of how to engage stakeholders across systems in policy reform in addition to focusing on juvenile justice policy. So I will turn it back over to Shannon. Oh, I think we have one more slide, sorry. Yeah, so we also wanted to just, there's tons and tons of data and information out there about, unfortunately, the really high negative public health outcomes for LGBTQ youth. So this was just one study done by the CDC around sexual minority youth, which focused on lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth. But you'll see at the bottom that negative health risk factors were higher across 4 areas: sexual behavior, high risk for substance abuse, violence and victimization, and mental health and suicide. And those are really important takeaways because obviously you may be working with a lot of young people who experience a lot of trauma and are entering into your system already having been the victim of a lot of violence and harassment, and also that having access to safety and also affirming mental health services, behavioral health services is really critical because of already these sort of statistical risk and experiences. And also while these were for lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth, we know that for transgender youth, these statistics are even higher. And of course, it's always worth reemphasizing that these risks are not inherent to being LGBT, but are a factor of discrimination and bias and mistreatment in general society. And part of what we're talking about today is really the things that folks within the juvenile justice system can do to flip this script. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about professional standards, but I'll turn it back over to Shannon to talk specifically about LGBTQ in juvenile justice settings.
Thanks, Curry. So yeah, we're going to take a moment, and literally it will be a moment, to talk about some of the challenges that young people, LGBT youth, experience in juvenile justice settings, and then we're going to move to talking about what some of the opportunities are. So how do the risks that Curry was just talking about translate to the experiences of LGBTQ youth in confinement, for example. You see a long list here, and I'll go over them quickly. Historically, one of the strategies used to protect youth at high risk in confinement facilities was to place them in protective custody, or essentially isolation. Happily, that practice is changing, but not entirely. I still see examples of it. Somebody needs to go on mute because I can hear an echo. Thanks. And research, of course, has shown the devastating impact of isolation on human beings generally, but specifically on youth. And it was just a practice that, and continues to be a practice that is used more often with youth who are either identify as LGBTQ or who are assumed to be LGBTQ. Much higher rates of victimization, and this can include bullying, harassment, and physical and sexual abuse. And this occurs both at the hands of other young people in facilities and also, unfortunately, at the hands of staff. LGBTQ youth are often treated differently from their peers. A couple of the most common examples of that are requiring LGBTQ youth to suppress or hide their identities, so blaming them for their own mistreatment, sort of along the lines of, if you would just stop acting this way, then people wouldn't be bothering you. The other kind of related experience of youth is youth getting punished when they defend themselves against bullying or harassment, and usually bullying or harassment that has not been responded to by staff, just ignored. Putting youth in circumstances where they need to, confinement facilities are very highly binary kinds of settings, right? So the sex segregated settings can include housing units, bathrooms, showers, clothing, programming, and other aspects of facility management are literally divided by gender, by sex. So this places obviously trans and gender non-binary or gender non-conforming youth in a terrible bind, forcing them to either endure really unsafe settings or to suppress or hide or in some way suppress their authentic gender. Strict sex segregation by assigned sex, which is not uncommon, can be very physically and emotionally harmful for youth. So having practices such as requiring trans girls to shave their heads when they come into a facility, that's a very common one, or forcing youth, trans girls to dress in boys' clothing in the boys' unit, and so forth. This, again, is very, very emotionally and physically harmful. Outing youth, so confidentiality violations. So outing LGBT youth to other youth, or to parents or other folks in the justice system is, without their consent, can subject them to mistreatment, to rejection, or serious emotional or physical harm. There's been a lot of very important research done in the last 10 or 15 years showing that families really are the most important resource for LGBT youth. That's of course true for all youth, but specifically true in the sense that for LGBT youth, when families engage in very high levels of rejecting behaviors, these youth are shown to be at significantly higher risk of suicidality, substance abuse, and other health risks. So what that means is engaging with these families in particular is really important around trying to make sure that as youth re-enter their communities and families, that they're not returning to situations that place them at extremely high risk. And finally, lack of access to affirming providers. And again, there's the sort of most common conditions or practices are mental health professionals or other staff who may engage in either formal or informal conversion therapy. In other words, communicating with youth or suggesting to them that they can or should change their sexual orientation or gender identity or expression. These practices have been roundly discredited by all the relevant professional associations, and many states now have laws prohibiting this practice. Nevertheless, much of it occurs in a informal way, and it's incredibly harmful to LGBTQ youth. And also lack of experienced healthcare professionals for trans and gender non-binary youth who need access to gender-affirming care. I think one of the misconceptions that commonly occurs is that young people can simply wait until they are released from the system. And it's really important to understand that waiting is actually not a neutral option, any more than waiting to treat any medical issue is a neutral option. And in fact, waiting or declining to provide this care can really exacerbate symptoms of gender dysphoria. Next slide, please. There we go. So on the other side, what does this suggest in terms of what facilities and personnel can do to provide positive opportunities for LGBT youth in the system and to promote their health and well-being? And really, it's sort of the flip side of the coin. So, you know, the point of this entire webinar is talking really about adopting policies and procedures, practices that protect youth, all youth really, from SOGI-based discrimination, which thereby promotes the health and safety really of all the youth. It's important, as Curry mentioned, that LGBTQ youth, like all youth, thrive when they are affirmed and supported. So trying to facilitate positive connections to community. So for example, by approving visits from affirming family and friends and promoting those positive connections in the community for LGBTQ youth, making sure that any materials, written or visual, that are in facilities, as well as educational programming, have positive, accurate information about LGBTQ people and identities, engaging with families to help them understand the positive impact they can have on their children's health and emotional stability by engaging in affirming and positive, accepting behaviors of their youth. Looking for opportunities to educate all youth about SOGI. For example, ensuring that sex education and other kinds of programming is inclusive of LGBTQ youth. And working with LGBTQ affirming providers and community-based organizations, both to provide programming in facilities and to facilitate positive reentry when young people are being released. And finally, ensuring that the health and mental health providers that are working with young people are competent, experienced providers that understand and practice the professional standards that have been developed for treating trans and non-binary youth, making sure that that expertise is available to those young people. And I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Curry to talk a little bit about some of the professional standards.
Just wanted to make sure that everyone is just aware of sort of the general body of work out there that all taken together kind of constitutes the professional standards around the treatment of LGBTQ youth. And some is just really thinking about LGBT youth in general, sort of across the board, whether it's in home, school, community, and then other are very specific to the juvenile justice section. So go to the next slide. So this is Gavin Grim, who some of you may be familiar with because Gavin was trying to access restrooms consistent with who he is in his school in Virginia, and his case made it to the Supreme Court. They didn't actually decide the case. It was kicked back down to a lower court. But it was an opportunity for lots of people to hear about who Gavin is and his access to just basic affirmation in the school setting. But what we wanted to mention here is a brief that was filed by a whole host of organizations about trans youth specifically, and about non-discrimination and access to facilities consistent with their identities. Go ahead and hit next on the slide. Right. So what was significant about this is it's an amicus brief that was filed before the Supreme Court, and basically just kind of summarizing where the community that sets professional standards around health and well-being for youth is around making sure that young people are receiving treatment that is designed to affirm their identity wherever they are with that, rather than being forced to live in conformance with their sex assigned at birth. Next. So one really important takeaway, I think, is that we often think about discrimination as being a violation of rights or a legal issue, but really more and more we're seeing research focusing on discrimination as being harmful to well-being, and that trying to eliminate those disparities and make sure youth are treated fairly and equitably actually is good for their well-being and health. And focusing on that actually helps flip some of these disparities that we talked about earlier in the research and data part. Next. And you can just keep clicking through until all of these different little bubbles. So these are all the organizations that signed on to this brief. So you can kind of see it's basically all of the heavy hitters in terms of national organizations that comment on the health of well-being in youth. And I think really important just for us to note that these are the organizations that we turn to regularly for guidance on what's good for kids. And they all basically say the same thing, which sort of amounts to like, yeah, mistreatment and harm to LGBT youth and not affirming their identities is not good for them. So very basic, but important. And I think another reason why making sure that this particular population has their needs met and affirmed is really an important place to focus given what we know about outcomes. So we are going to do one more slide here about professional standards. You can go to the next slide. And you can go ahead and click a few times to get all these out. So this is just an example from the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry of a policy statement that's very specific to trans youth. And basically that youth should be housed consistent with their identities. They define it, referred to by the name that they use, and have access, as Shannon just mentioned, to comprehensive psychiatric and other medical care consistent with the standards and guidelines like the ones we just saw from these major organizations. So again, just for all of you to know that basically all of these entities are pretty uniform in some of their basic guidelines for how youth should be treated. So I'll turn it back over to Shannon now, and we're actually going to get into a little bit more of the weeds sort of about policy in this area. So.
So I'm going to start by talking about the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or PREA, which I think most of you are probably familiar with. You can go ahead and click through the slide. PREA was the first federal act to contain specific protections for LGBTQI youth. And the reason for that is the data that was developed by the Bureau of Justice Statistics made clear that this population was at a much higher risk of sexual abuse and sexual harm in confinement facilities. So PREA actually goes into a lot of detail and contains several specific protections for LGBTI youth. And by the way, we have not said anything yet, I don't think, about intersex youth, which is a part of this population that's specifically protected by PREA. And intersex youth, it's a term to describe variations in sex characteristics. When a person is born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't seem to fit typical definitions of male or female. And I'm sorry, I failed to mention that earlier when we were talking about terms. So what PREA does is, again, identify the heightened risk to LGBTI youth of harassment or abuse in confinement facilities. Really importantly, it requires consideration among many other aspects and facts of a person's sexual orientation and gender identity when conducting the risk assessment at the front end to determine housing and classification. A lot of work has been done in the field about how to implement that particular part of PREA, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. It obviously prohibits harassment and violence, sexual violence in particular, against all youth, but including LGBTI youth. Also really important, requiring individualized decisions, housing decisions for trans and gender non-binary youth, which requires that, which really prohibits any kind of automatic rule. So for example, rules that, or policies that automatically assign youth to housing based on their assigned sex are prohibited by PREA, and the standards require a specific conversation with the youth to get their own perspective on their safety. There are significant limitations placed on the use of protective isolation. It can only be used for very short periods of time. Generally speaking, it's not the strategy for keeping young people safe. PREA requires that young people are treated with respect and that respectful language be used. It prohibits cross-gender viewing and any type of search, cross-gender search, pat searches, strip searches, and it requires privacy, that facilities provide privacy for transgender and intersex youth while showering, using the bathroom, or in any situation where they're unclothed. So those are several of the protections that are contained in PREA. Next slide, please. What PREA doesn't cover specifically, and are some other practices and conditions that are critical to maintaining the safety of young people in confinement settings. It doesn't identify clear non-discrimination requirements, though most policies, as we will discuss in a moment, that address this at all do have a very clear non-discrimination provision. It doesn't, because it's focused specifically on sexual misconduct and sexual abuse, it doesn't address the broader issues of promoting positive youth development in general or specifically of LGBTQI youth. Lots of facilities, and I talk to people who work in facilities all the time, have a lot of questions about how to operationalize the standards that require individualized housing decisions for trans and intersex youth. What does that look like? What do you consider? What are the challenges that are posed by physical plant limitations, for example, places that have only dorms for housing units? There's a lot of operational questions around how to implement those standards. It does not define what cross-gender means for trans and intersex youth. What does that term mean? What is a cross-gender search of a transgender or intersex youth? There is some guidance on that issue from the PREA Resource Center. But again, the standards are not definitive about what that means, how it's applied in that situation. So there's lots of questions come up about that. It doesn't define respectful language. So for example, it doesn't specify that when you're interacting with transgender or gender non-binary youth, that you'd use the names and pronouns that they use rather than their legal name and their pronoun associated with their assigned sex. Does not provide guidance. Again, another question that comes up all the time in trainings and conversations with folks who work in facilities is how do you collect information from young people at the front end when you're doing a risk assessment? What does it look like? What do you ask? How do you ask? In what ways can you create an environment in which young people are going to feel more comfortable disclosing that information? So again, operationalizing some of those standards. And it doesn't address at all. Again, because it's focused on sexual abuse, it doesn't give guidance to facilities at all about what does gender affirming medical care look like or behavioral health care. So those are some of the things that PREA does not directly address. Next slide, please. So partly for that reason and partly in response to the most common questions that come up around, in particular, transgender, gender nonconforming, and intersex youth, the PREA Resource Center recently funded a mini grant, and we were able to bring together a group of professionals from around the country to work on developing a model policy that attempts to be more comprehensive in its treatment and addressing of the very practical operational issues that come up in confinement facilities. And I know we're not going to get into a lot of that today, but I just want to highlight this as a resource that's one of the resources provided to you for this webinar that does go into detail around operationalizing a safe and affirming environment in confinement facilities for this population. And I'm going to turn it over to Curry to talk a little bit more about what some of the laws look like as well as policy.
Thanks, Shannon. So I'm going to take us home here for these last 3 slides, and then we'll open it up for some questions. And just wanted to focus for a minute a little bit on some of the legal protections that young people do have and how that has played out, at least in one kind of major court case about this population involving juvenile facilities. So of course, there's federal law, specifically the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act that has sex as a protected class discrimination, but youth obviously have constitutional rights while they're placed out of home and in detention or correctional settings. And way back in 2006, there were some young people in Hawaii's institutional blocked facility that were being severely mistreated and harassed, both peer-to-peer and staff to youth. And basically the judge in the case found that the degree of the problems had risen to the level of constitutional violations and problems, and specifically that the facility had failed to maintain policies and training necessary to protect LGBT youth, even though they were aware they were being harmed. And that included not having adequate staffing and supervision, a functioning grievance system around these issues, and a classification system that protected youth. So just sort of a cautionary tale out there of really like why it's so important to make sure that now that we know and have a lot of information about the negative outcome and experiences of young people, that we're actually taking some affirmative steps to make sure that they're healthy and safe. Next slide. And you can go ahead and click through these so we get the whole list. Thank you. So one of the things that we've worked quite a bit with CJCA around, and that Shannon and I do a lot of consulting and working with both state and local administrators of systems, is really developing a sort of fully fleshed out LGBTQ specific policy. And kind of what we were getting at in Shannon's description of PREA and what it does and doesn't do is that for all the debate on what good things of PREA, bad things about PREA, I mean, it really has certainly helped educate a lot of people around how at-risk LGBTQ youth and those who are perceived to be are for harassment and assault. But obviously that's an important yet a limiting framing, and of course not one that is very a positive sort of youth development focus, and doesn't, as Shannon mentioned, really have any basic protections against discrimination. So one of the things that we recommend and is included in a number of the states that have LGBTQ specific policies is just basic language that prohibits discrimination around all protected classes, race, ethnicity, religion, disability, but also includes sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression as protected classes. But we know that just having those basics there doesn't really mean that folks know exactly what it means not to discriminate on the basis of gender identity, for example, or gender expression, or even what those terms mean. So LGBTQ specific policies have a terms and definitions section. They talk about how you actually go about conducting intake, thinking about classification, hearing what the young person wants, respecting their gender identity, and housing them consistent with that if that's what the youth wants to do. Making sure that staff understand that part of not discriminating on gender identity means that you can and should use the names and pronouns the youth uses, not necessarily what appears on the legal documents or may still be their legal name. Provides more guidance on searches. Make sure that young people have access if they have been receiving hormone therapy before entering the facility, that they're able to continue that. If they would like access to a qualified medical provider to have a conversation about healthcare needs that they have, or to answer any questions they have about gender affirming healthcare, that they have access to that. Making sure that it's a policy of the agency to make sure youth have access to those providers, and that those providers have been screened and are qualified. That has specifics about how youth become aware of the policy and what they do if there's been a violation of the policy and they need to uphold a grievance. Shannon had mentioned that confidentiality is an issue, so these types of policies actually spell out exactly when it's okay to share information, and really give some guidance about making sure that we're not ever doing that absent some sort of emergent circumstance without a youth's consent. Require training on the specifics of the policy, and really acknowledge that young people have the right to information, affirming information while they're in facility, should be granted access to community support. Specifies that youth and their families should have support around affirmation of identity, and have specifics about banning some of the quote conversion therapy activities that can go on both formally and informally and also talk a little bit more in connection with the terms and definitions section about what exactly is professional and respectful language for LGBTQ youth. So Shannon mentioned the model policy that's out there. So that is just an excellent summary that contains some of these specifics we're talking about. Also, as part of your materials is the Federal Advisory Committee on Juvenile Justice, put out at the very beginning of 2017. They convened an LGBTQ subcommittee. Shannon and I were a part of that, along with a lot of other professionals, administrators, folks in the system, and they spelled out some really specific guidance to OJJDP, and for them to put that out to the states with a lot of specifics about how states should affirm and support LGBTQ youth. So those documents have a lot of great guidance, and I'll mention a couple of other resources that we have for you, and then I'll go to the final slide here. Great. So this is a map that we put together, and you can find it there on the website at the bottom, which kind of classifies states by at least what we were able to find with publicly available information about whether sexual orientation and gender identity appear anywhere as protected classes, either in statute, regulation, or agency policy. And then the states in purple are ones that actually have these detailed LGBTQ specific policies that I was mentioning. And if you go to the map, you can actually click on the state, and then you'll see a link to the actual policy. So you can take a look and see what some of these policies say, and they vary in terms of when they were put out, as things rapidly change, their level of length and specificity, but it's great to see what's out there. And then I will just acknowledge that some of the places that that don't have them, I know, are working on them. Like Alaska is now working on a policy, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona. There are a number of places that have, North Carolina, have policies in the works. So I think as of our count now, there are about 20. I know Delaware has one now that have these detailed policies in place in the District of Columbia. And then, of course, there are lots of local detention centers, probation officers, counties that have implemented some policies, but these are statewide ones. So I'll just close by letting you know that there are a few other resources that I haven't mentioned. One is a great overview and guide that Shannon worked on through Annie Casey and JDAI initiative. Another is a report we worked on with Children's Rights and the Center for the Study of Social Policy, which goes into detail about law and policy and practice tips for affirming trans and gender expansive youth and out-of-home care. And then another great report called Restoring Justice that was put out Center for the American Progress and the Equity Project on policy basics and implementation in this area. So we hope that the combination of today's overview and those resources and the PowerPoint at your disposal, it's a really helpful overview about the basics and policy in this area, and we'll stop there and take a few questions if we have them.
Well, thank you, Shannon and Curry. We really do appreciate your time today, sharing your expertise, and you certainly have covered a lot of territory in the 55 minutes that you've been presenting. So we do have a few questions. One is from New York, and the question is, I'm wondering if there are any examples of ways family courts have gathered SOGI information for youth engaged in delinquency.
Curry, should I grab that one?
Yeah, do you want to?
Sure. I'm actually involved in a project that's working with several different sites right now on collecting SOGI data in justice systems, and the SOGI questionnaire that was developed as part of that is actually at a what's the word I'm looking for? It's at the end of the model policy that's listed in your resources, and it gives lots of information about what questions people are asking, and there's also been some work done on how to include these drop-down menus in case management systems and protect the information the confidentiality of the information as well. So I'd be happy to talk with anybody who wants to have more information about that and give you some examples of policies that have been developed.
And then I know that the Office of Court Administration in New York does have an LGBTQ committee. At one point, there was a family court committee here, and a conversation about data collection is happening there, and I know that's happening in other places. So I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Shannon, that there is a specific family court jurisdiction that has already sort of fully implemented and has data around LGBTQ youth in the juvenile justice system, but a lot in the works. Is that accurate?
That's right. I mean, we're literally on the cusp of analyzing the data that's been collected in 6 to 9 jurisdictions. So it's definitely happening. And again, I'm happy to provide any of this information. I don't think it's happening at a statewide level, except, if I'm not mistaken, in Connecticut. Like all of Connecticut is now collecting the information.
Okay, well, thanks for that response. And I know we're about out of time, but I would like to get one more question in. If you could answer it in maybe 30, 45 seconds. A component that seems to be missing is advocacy in the face of policymakers who don't recognize the special needs of LGBTQ youth. How do you care for these youth when the system in which you are working doesn't recognize the needs of special populations?
I can take a quick stab at that of one approach, I think, and Shannon can add in. I mean, I think one way is to really just engage with the community at large. The LGBT community, service providers that are working with youth, young people themselves who are system involved or recent alums of the system. I think we've really seen in some jurisdictions kind of the power of, if it's not a possibility to get at it top down, then you can get at it grassroots up. By engaging people on the ground, because we have so many more out LGBTQ youth that everybody working on the ground is seeing the need to do more, and obviously youth themselves more so than anybody. So kind of activating those folks can help put some pressure up, or just do what you can do without support at the top if you don't have support at the top. But I do think there's more and more light there of really having a lot of jurisdictions see the need, and pressure from every side is great.
Well, thank you both for the presentation, and I'll turn things over to Peter Forbes for a few final words and a little preview of what's coming next.
Okay, well, thank you, Simone, Curry, and Shannon. That was it was very helpful to me, and I hope it was helpful to everybody else that jumped on the call. 2 things. One is there's going to be a survey available when the participants close out. There'll be a survey, and it'll be really helpful to give us some feedback on today's webinar so we can know what we need to do moving forward. And on June 11th at 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, we have the juvenile justice leadership from Georgia and Colorado are going to get on that call and talk about how they changed practice, implemented policy, and work through some of the staffing challenges related to LGBTQU work in the juvenile justice context. So we're going to take it kind of down a level closer to the facility work with young people on June 11th, and I hope some or all of you are able to join us. Thank you very much, and thank you, Wendy. That's it. Over and out.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.